So honestly, risers seem like a very boring topic for a video, but I do actually have something interesting to say about them. Today we're going to be working on this project over here. This is the project that I've featured a few times now on this channel. It's a relatively new project, and one of the things that I've been doing is I've been thinking more about the placement of my risers. So what do I mean by that? Don't you just have the riser rise up to the point where you want to transition into a new section or something like that? Well, not entirely, because there are a few points where you can rise into with your risers. So first of all, the most basic idea happens over here. This is the start of the drop, this line over here. And if we scroll down, we can see that this riser does not actually connect there. So we're not actually rising into this drop. Where we are rising into is this section over here, which is just a little fill. As you can see, the kick and bass is filtered in over here, and then it stops, and then the fill happens, and then we get into the drop. At least that is what it looks like on the surface level if you just look into the effects. Let's open up the one-shots group here, and let's have a look at some of the other one-shots. Because some of these one-shots actually have a very cool property here, in that they're essentially risers. As you can hear, a very strong rising quality to it, but there is also an interesting texture in there. It is kind of like your riser atmosphere detail kind of sound, a little bit of everything. Same is true over here. We have this sound right here. And what I decided to do here was to have a reverse reverb into this sound. But notice where all of these elements are in terms of the arrangement. We have one that lines up over here, we have one that lines up in the middle, and then we have one that lines up both in this part over here, so it lines up exactly with this riser over here, but then also goes into the drop. So we have this combination of risers all rising to different parts, which makes a very interesting, continuously rising part of the track. As you can hear, we're basically morphing between different rising ideas, which just continuously increases the energy over time up until you get to this point in the drop where everything cuts off and we just have the drop coming in. And I'm doing this all the time, even on a micro level. If we look at these drums, for example, over here, what you'll see is that they're essentially rising into this point where we have a little fill element here. So what is happening is that we have these snares, then they combine together into these snares, which are just a little bit faster, so you get a little bit of extra energy, and then we get into the basically like the fill idea for this part, which is still in the same rhythm, but it's no longer rising as the filter, as you can see, is no longer opening. It is already fully open and therefore at its full potential. It's not rising any further. Another little bit more far-fetched example of rising is happening over here, where we have this drum fill followed by this other drum fill. Notice how the first drum fill is a little bit softer sounding than the second one. In this one, the drum really has a nice slapping and impactful quality to it, where this one is a little bit more softer. So you can notice that we have a little bit of energy over here, and then it just slightly increased because of the different sounds that we're using here. So in this case, you could argue that we're rising into this part over here because this is where the transition from lower energy to higher energy of this particular element is happening. So for now, we've been focusing just on this little part over here, but I could zoom out and I could show you examples all over the place with interesting things that I'm doing in terms of risers and rising energy in general. There are obviously a lot more ideas like combining two risers into one to give you a riser that changes in terms of its texture. So for example, over here, we start off with this longer riser here, and that then kind of gets taken over by this riser over here because it's slightly louder in volume. So for example, over here we have this riser which is nice and long. We get used to this riser by this time. So we have another riser in here that just changes the texture and makes it more exciting. Over here I have another example of that where I'm doing something very, very similar. In this case, I'm using a riser which is just kind of fading out here so that the new riser can literally just take over in that space. And you can imagine that this is all done within the context of the track. Obviously, what I'm doing here is I'm looking at where my fill is going to be, and that lines up exactly with where that fade is happening. So that means that in the drop itself, we're rising, and then when the fill happens, we're actually changing texture. So this is another differentiator between what is happening in the drop and what is happening in the fill, which means that the fill is slightly more emphasized. Now, one thing you can probably gather from this is that everything that I'm doing here is very much influenced by the structure of my track. This is another good reason why I would recommend starting out with a structure of the track in the beginning of the production, so that you can play around with the structure and therefore also the placement and use of your rising elements. Because that is what allows you to come up with stuff like this. As you can even see from the structure track, this was initially not the goal here. What I had in mind was a build-up up until this point here, and then a little fill that would announce the next segment of the drop here. But what I ended up doing through experimentations with the elements that I was adding was something along the lines of this. Something where the fill is actually just one beat here, and the build-up is happening all the way up until this beat. And you can hear in this case, all of the different elements that sit in here have the goal of just rising up until this exact point over here. After which we have this little hey thing over here and a reverse kick, which is just a really nice way to quickly transition into the drop. So as you can probably tell from this video, there's a lot to think about when placing risers and rising elements. I hope that I could explain my thought process in a clear manner, although there's many different considerations, as you can tell, that go into the placement of your risers. It's not just, oh, I need a riser, let's drop in a sample and call it there. The final big recommendation that I have is just to test every single possibility that you have in a fill. So for example, here we have a drum fill, so we could rise up till the end here, we could rise up until here, we could rise up to the beginning of the fill. And we should listen to how every single placement of the element can change the flow of the track. For this one, I'm actually thinking of changing it to a placement somewhat like this, so that it rises neatly into this drum fill over here. So that's it. That's everything that I wanted to talk about today. I hope you learned something and that you enjoyed the video. Let me know if you did by leaving a like and making sure that you subscribe to the channel. But that's going to be it. I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.